Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about Nintendo's 2022 lineup, the lineup for next year, and also another Switch revision. I know. Everyone has given up on Switch Pro, and I am very skeptical myself at this point as well. But there is an argument going on, there is a speculation going on, there are insiders suggesting that next year, in 2022, there will be the Switch Pro, or a 4K capable Switch, or at least some sort of upgraded Switch in terms of actual power. And it kind of makes sense when you consider that the game lineup that's coming out next year seems to be stronger than the lineup of games we got this year and the year prior. So, kind of brings me to the title of the video. Is Nintendo's big 2022 lineup all in support for another Switch revision? That's what we're talking about today. Now, before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. So there's quite a few angles to this situation regarding what may be happening next year. There is the game lineup next year. It is looking to be really strong. We're going to be talking about that. But then there's also this situation of, does it even make sense for Nintendo to release another revision next year? The Switch OLED, which was just announced, is really mostly an improvement for the handheld experience or the tabletop experience. Besides the LAN port inside the dock, there isn't really much improvements to the home console experience there, but nevertheless, it is $50 more expensive than the base Switch. And if you look at the way Nintendo's been handling the Switch, it still hasn't seen any price drops yet. The initial Switch came out March 2017, and it has stayed $300, and as of this recording, in July of 2021, it doesn't look like we're getting a price drop this year either. And then the Switch Lite, which came out September 2019, 2.5 years after the initial Switch, that has maintained its price of $200 as well. But now they've added another revision as a part of the family of systems. They're showcasing all of them together, and this one is $350. They haven't dropped any prices for any of these systems, and there was at least 2 years of a difference between each of these systems. So, would Nintendo all of a sudden bring out a $400 Switch next year that has 4K capabilities, just $50 more expensive than this OLED model, and it's just a year removed from this Switch OLED thing? Like, is that really what's going on here? That, to me, is where I am sort of a little skeptical. However, I do believe that all of that information suggesting DLSS support, 4K capabilities, I don't think that was a fabrication. I do think that's information that is coming from behind the scenes of Nintendo working on a more powerful system. That totally makes sense because guess what? Nintendo is always working on their next hardware. That's not out of the question. But ideas change, development for both software and hardware is fluid. Things can be pulled, things can be delayed, things can be canceled. So maybe there was some sort of Switch Pro that may have been coming, but now I am skeptical. But there are still insiders that continue to stress that Switch Pro will come out next year, right? It does feel a little bit maybe like a goalpost moving situation. Oh, it's going to be this year. Nope, it's going to be next year, actually. But when you take into consideration that COVID has caused all these delays for everything, maybe we should be willing to concede that it could potentially happen. And that's what brings me to Nintendo's 2022 lineup. If you look at the software, it is very, very strong. Very strong. So far, and we're still just half a year away from that year, and there will be games surely announced all throughout that year as well. But so far we know about the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That's likely going to be the biggest game to come out that year, or one of the biggest ones. But then there's also Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope, Project Triangle Strategy, Splatoon 3, and Pokemon Legends Arceus, an open-world Pokemon game coming out this January. Those are already the officially confirmed announced games for 2022 that are going to be published by Nintendo. That's 5, and they're all pretty big games that are going to do pretty well. But there's also a lot more potential for next year. there is potentially Bayonetta 3. The game has been in development since 2017. Surely by 2022, we could see the game, right? We might even see some footage of the game this year, and the reason we didn't see it during Nintendo's E3 Direct was because they were focusing on games for 2021. So maybe Bayonetta 3 is a game for next year. But even if it's not Bayonetta 3, what about Monolith Soft? They've been working on a few different projects, one of which also since 2017. That could conceivably come out next year. But then there's also the Nintendo EPD group that's behind ARMS and Mario Kart. They've also been working on a big project since presumably 2017 when they finished ARMS. So that also could potentially come out next year as well. Those are 3 major games that could also come out next year. But then on top of that, there is the Donkey Kong game that we've been hearing about and the Fire Emblem remake we've been hearing about. It's been long rumored from different places. I've personally heard things myself. I do believe that they are coming. Sure, they haven't been officially confirmed yet, but they are strong possibilities for games to come out next year as well. And this is also assuming that there isn't like a new generation of Pokemon coming out next year. I understand Pokemon Legends Arceus is coming out in January, but every 3 years we usually get a new Pokemon generation. So conceivably, we could see another Pokemon game come out at the end of the year from Game Freak. Now, right now I'm kind of thinking that maybe they push things off another year or at least another 6 months. We'll see, but it's just something worth noting that also potentially could come out next year. But the list gets even larger because there's also supposedly Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD that are just in a vault somewhere waiting to be released. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe that comes out early next year to tide Zelda fans over until Breath of the Wild 2 for presumably holiday 2022. But then there's also Prime Trilogy HD. We're finally getting a Metroid game with Metroid Dread this year. Prime 4 I do not expect next year. It's maybe possible, but probably not. I could see that being more of a 2023 title. But in the meanwhile, Nintendo may finally pull out Prime Trilogy, another game that's supposedly been in the vault for quite some time. And on the note of these games that have been in development or finished for quite a long time, there's also Pikmin 4. We know we're getting a Pikmin mobile game now. Pikmin have had an involvement with the Super Nintendo World Park from Universal Studios. It's seeming like Nintendo is building up that Pikmin marketing. They even had Pikmin 3 Deluxe last year. So another possibility for a big game to come out next year is Pikmin 4. And I haven't even mentioned Kirby yet. That's another game that we could be seeing, potentially a couple different versions of Kirby within the next year or so. So there's a lot of games, and I'm sure I didn't even mention all of them. There's probably other games that will be announced between now and next year that will be coming out at some point in 2022, and that's still not even including all the potential third-party releases either. In other words, 2022 is looking to be one of the strongest lineups yet. We speculated that we'd be seeing a really strong lineup this year and the year prior, but this time around we already have some hard confirmations for big games coming out next year, and those gaps have to be filled up with something as well. So things are looking really, really good. But usually when you see strong software coming out in a big sort of window like this, it is suggestive that there is hardware coming out. In 2017, it's arguably the best year Nintendo has ever had in terms of software releases. We've mentioned it many times before. Splatoon 2, Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, ARMS, Mario Odyssey, Fire Emblem Warriors, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Mario Rabbids Kingdom Battle. All of that came out in 2017, and there's a few others that I have not even mentioned, but that all came out to support the initial release for the Nintendo Switch. Then look at Switch Lite in 2019. Within about a 6 to 7 month window, we got Mario Maker 2, Link's Awakening Remake, Dragon Quest XI's, Astral Chain, Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Pokemon Sword and Shield, Luigi's Mansion 3, Daemon X Machina. It was also a very dense lineup of quality games during that period. Point is, whenever there's been really strong software lineups, we see Nintendo release hardware. Even for this year, while it may not be the biggest year ever in terms of software releases from Nintendo, it is a nice, densely packed sort of lineup of games between now and the end of the year. We just got Mario Golf, we're getting Skyward Sword HD next week, we're getting Advance Wars, we're getting WarioWare, we're getting Pokemon Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, we're getting Metroid Dread. there's a decent lineup coming, and of course the Switch OLED is coming out in October alongside Metroid Dread. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned Mario Party, which is also coming out in October. Point is, there's a decent lineup of games coming out all throughout this year as well, and we're getting hardware. So when you take into consideration that there's this strong sort of pattern of densely packed windows of software releases and hardware releases from Nintendo, it does maybe support the idea of these people still believing in a Switch Pro coming out next year. But I'm not so sure it's going to be a Pro necessarily. It may be a more powerful Switch. It does make sense to eventually upgrade the Switch. The Switch has been out since March of 2017. March 2022 will mark the 5-year anniversary. Usually Nintendo systems only last somewhere between 4 and 6 years, but this is a different time. Perhaps the lines between generations is blurring, perhaps generations are becoming longer. The Switch is still seeing great success. There's no reason for Nintendo to slow down now, so they definitely want to maintain that momentum as long as possible. But going back to the very initial argument, we just got an increased price of Switch OLED, so could Nintendo get away with releasing an even more expensive model next year and for it to all kind of make sense? Well, let's take a quick look at the way Nintendo handled the 3DS, because it's quite interesting. So in early 2011, the initial Nintendo 3DS released for $250. However, the sales of that system were lackluster. Nintendo realized that they put that system out with far too high of a price. So not even 6 months later, in August, they dropped the price down by $80 to $169.99. And for all the early adopters, they introduced the Ambassadors program, which allowed anyone who had a 3DS before that price drop date to download 10 free Game Boy Advance games and 10 free NES games that were, for the most part, only available for that Ambassador program, even throughout most of the 3DS's lifespan. But moving on, not too long afterwards, barely a year later, summer of 2012, we saw the release for the 3DS XL priced at $200. And then barely a year after that, we saw the release for the Nintendo 2DS in late 2013 for $130. They finally got out a cheaper price point there, so Nintendo had a decent sort of family of systems by that point. You had the old 3DS, which was being phased out, but also the 3DS XL at $200 and the 2DS at $130. And then a year after that, in Japan, late 2014, Nintendo released the new 3DS. And by early 2015, so barely a year, maybe closer to 15 months after the release of the 2DS in late 2013, early 2015, we saw the release of the new 3DS XL in everywhere else outside of Japan, and that system was priced at $200, with the new 3DS being priced just a little bit under that, I think $170. And then 2.5 years later, once the Switch was already out, they announced the new 2DS XL, which came out that summer of 2017 for $150. So there were a lot of revisions that came out during the 3DS's life cycle. But what I'm noticing here is that there's at least an annual gap between revisions, usually more than a year, usually closer to 15 months. So if we stick to that pattern, if Nintendo holds to that pattern, which they haven't done during the Switch era, it's been every 2 years or so, but if they were to go back to that and follow up with a Switch Pro a year from now, that would be a very quick turnaround by comparison. And never throughout that 3DS generation did they release a revision that was more expensive and then follow it up with an even more expensive revision after that. They would release an expensive revision and then a cheaper revision, an expensive revision and then a cheaper revision. So this is kind of a peculiar situation we're considering here. Could we see that 4K revision that's been so long rumored come out next year and be even more expensive than this OLED version? It's tough to say because Nintendo marches to the beat of their own drum. They can do whatever they like, and depending on how they market things, they can get away with it. If they do a price drop at the end of next year, that would be a year removed from the release of the Switch OLED, which may not leave fans feeling as burned as when the initial 3DS came out back when it did, and Nintendo dropped the price by a whole $80 less than half a year after that point. So it would be a different situation. So conceivably, maybe by the end of next year, Switch OLED drops down to $300, and the Switch Pro or Switch 4K comes out for $400. maybe that's a possibility. It still feels like a little bit of a stretch to me because it seems like such a quick turnaround after the release of this system, but when you look at that software lineup and you look at the reports from the sources, it does feel like something is brewing. But one sort of thing that has become quite common with getting rumors or leaks or what have you from even the good sources is that the timing is always very hard to pin down. Pretty consistently does it seem like people kind of get the timing wrong with a lot of these things. So maybe the system doesn't even come out in 2022, maybe it comes out in 2023, and by that point, I could maybe see Nintendo more easily getting away with putting out an even more expensive revision. Could they conceivably still get away with it if they were to do it next year? Probably, yeah. But it just would be something they haven't really done before. Now, there are some people who know things that are saying some things. So, for example, Takashi Mochizuki quoted and retweeted this Bloomberg article, and here he says, "This new Switch looks more like an interim model than a real upgrade to me. This might just be a dummy upgrade until Breath of the Wild 2 is ready and the component shortage is over next year." And maybe that's the case. Maybe because of COVID, things are pushed up. Similar to how we've argued that maybe Breath of the Wild 2 is pushed up because of COVID as well. And maybe they both come out for holiday 2022. That is conceivable. But another thing to consider here is that maybe we're looking at a situation where it's not a straight up revision like a PS4 Pro. Maybe it's more like a situation kind of like Game Boy Color, as Samus Hunter on Twitter was alluding to. So the interesting thing with Game Boy Color, while it was technically considered as part of the same generation as Game Boy, it served to lengthen the lifespan of that generation far more than most Nintendo systems we've seen, and the games did look better. They were in color, which was a big deal back then for a portable system. But then on top of that, as they progressed into more of the lifespan of the Game Boy Color as opposed to the Game Boy, they continually started to release more and more games that were exclusive to that system, but there was a transition. It wasn't immediate, and it's possible we see something like that this time around as well. So say by holiday 2022, as some people are suggesting, I'm thinking maybe a little bit later, but let's say by then at the earliest, we do get a more powerful revision. At first, it's going to be fully compatible with base Switch games. All games coming out for the system are going to be still playable on that Switch you got back in 2017, but maybe a year or two down the road, they increasingly start to release more and more exclusive titles, and they start to phase out that older Switch and such, and eventually, they'll release another revision, which will be compatible with that revision that comes out late 2022 or 2023, but it won't be compatible with systems before that. So we could be looking at a situation where Nintendo's looking to blur the lines between generation more so than they ever have before, but by doing that, they're lengthening the lifespan for the Switch far longer than any other home console variant for a Nintendo system, and I think that actually be pretty good for consumers. So if you got your Switch in 2017, I think it might be safe to say that even in 2023 or 2024, you're going to be getting games coming out from Nintendo that will still be playable on the system that's already 7 years old. And I think that's going to be pretty great. But also by that point, Nintendo may start to be doing a bit of an overlap and transitioning to their next system, let's say Switch 2, and that's how it's going to sort of be. And I think that could work out. But I think the ultimate point to be made here with this entire video is that Nintendo has big plans, clearly, and they are continually bringing out interesting things every single year. But we're also in a situation where it's sort of uncharted territory. It's not within the ordinary, it's very different, and it's very hard to predict what exactly is going to happen because there isn't really any appropriate historical precedents that gives us an exact idea of what's going to happen. And that's kind of exciting. It makes it kind of a puzzle to sort of speculate and see what's going to happen. But either way, I do think we have a lot of great things to come. We already have a lot of great things coming out this year, so I'm pretty content with what's going on right now. But what do you guys think? What do you guys make of this situation of it being a Switch 4K, a Switch 2, or something else, and just the overall games we could be seeing in 2022 that might be backing up this other revision we might see, or maybe not? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.